Good afternoon and welcome to the latest installment of the EU DisinfoLab webinars. The title of today's webinar is Safeguarding Information Integrity, the DSA in Action. Some housekeeping and other announcements to begin. Registration for the EU DisinfoLab Conference 2025 is now open. The conference website can be found at www.disinfo.eu/conference, and it will take place on the 15th and 16th of October in Ljubljana. This webinar is recorded. The recording will be available on our YouTube channel shortly. You can also access all of the previous webinars there as well. You will notice at the bottom of your screen a captions option where you can get other language versions of this webinar, or you can follow the QR code. For the questions and answers and polls on this webinar, we use Slido, not the Zoom Q&A. To access the Slido page, you go to slido.com and enter the code disinfo, or you can use the QR code that you should see on your screen. To start with, we have two polls, one where are you joining from, and two, what sector do you represent? You can ask questions in Slido at any time during the presentation, and we'll come back to the questions after the presentation. EU DisinfoLab is a not-for-profit organization gathering knowledge and expertise on disinformation in Europe. We organize these webinars to give voice to our experts in our amazing community and to help share knowledge and awareness around the work that's being done by so many. The topic today is a guide from the European Commission about how the Digital Services Act can and does protect information integrity. We're delighted to have an expert from the European Commission, Ľuboš Kukliš, who has in my knowledge, uniquely broad range of expertise, having worked currently in the Digital Services Act enforcement team in the Commission, and previously as director of the Slovak Media Authority, the chair of the European Platform of Regulatory Authorities, and chair of the European Regulators Group for Media Services, ERGA. So he's got expertise both in traditional media and platform regulation. So I'm very curious to hear this presentation. So I guess you are too. So I will hand over to Ľuboš to hear his wise words. Ľuboš, to you.
Thank you very much, Joe, and I hope I don't disappoint. I will share my screen now, so please tell me if this works. Now you should see in the first slide.
Yes, it's just coming up.
Okay, perfect. So also from my side, welcome everybody to this webinar, and thanks to DisinfoLab for inviting me here. This presentation will be about implementation of the Digital Services Act on information integrity, and I will be also talking about elections. We had a really crazy election year, the last one, and it kind of continues also now. And I will start with the outline of the DSA itself, and then I will narrow it down to the risk assessments and mitigation, then to the information integrity. And then we can, of course, talk about anything you would like to talk about after that. Well, of course, we can talk about the DSA. So, it's a legislation, harmonized legislation on the EU level that is aiming to bring safer digital space. And it is both based on two very broad principles. The first is protecting the fundamental rights of the users, and the other is to establish a level playing field for the businesses. Now, when we are talking about digital services, it's a broad range of services, of course, starting from online marketplaces, social networks, content sharing platforms, app stores, and so on. Why the DSA, right? The digital services have deep societal impact, and they present both opportunities and challenges, of course, and they are inherently global. So it usually doesn't make much sense to try to regulate them or govern them from a local perspective on a member state level within the EU, so to say. But there's been these attempts to do that, and it's threatened to create a fragmented rule set for the online platforms. And that's why the idea of a harmonized kind of legislation came about. Now, there were initiatives that went online with the ideas to govern certain aspects of risky behavior online. It started, for example, with the communication on illegal content in 2017. Then it turned to recommendation on illegal content. Then from them stemmed the initiative to have a voluntary code of conduct on illegal hate speech. And a similar thing happened with the approach to disinformation, with Code of Practice on Disinformation being a voluntary instrument where the major platforms sat down and devised a sub-regulatory code for themselves. But there were also kind of legislations for the sector-specific rules. So, for example, since 2018, we had a new Audiovisual Media Services Directive that also encompass the video sharing platforms, which are services that also now fall within the DSA. But the major example is YouTube, for example, and there were some rules set for those services there. There was also terroristic content regulation and platforms to business regulation. And the examples of national laws that were appearing at the time were famous or infamous, depending on the angle, how you look at it. NetzDG in Germany or Avia law in France. They later on went to different legal problems in Germany and France, respectively. But then on top of this, and all of this have been kind of solved by the Digital Services Act as a single set of rules for the EU for the online environment. Now, it builds on the e-commerce directive, since that was enacted in 2000. And the e-commerce directive is still applicable and still exists. So the Digital Services Act is kind of sitting on top of that. And there are two major principles that are retained within the DSA and kind of elaborated on from the e-commerce directive. The first is the liability exemption, which means that the digital services are not legally liable for the content that they carry unless they know about the legality of such a content. Now, how they get the information, it's not important. It can be by a notice from a user, from authority, or they can find out themselves. But if they then act expeditiously once having that information, they are retaining this limited liability or liability exemption. If they don't, it's not that they will be punished right after that, but they are losing this exemption, and any kind of responsibility or liability attached to that kind of content or carrying that kind of content by either national or EU legal rules can be then imposed. And the second principle is a no general monitoring obligation, which means that the law can't impose an obligation on the platforms to do the general monitoring. They can use filters themselves. They can do general monitoring if they wish to, but it can't be it can be an obligation set by law. And on top of that, of course, Digital Services Act now creates a whole new regulatory framework. It clarifies the rules on the liability exemption that I just explained. It creates incentives for other proactive measures that the platforms may use in order to address the potential risks online. There are a lot of due diligence obligations that the platforms need to apply by themselves and without being asked for that by any kind of authority, for example, and creates a common framework for the enforcement of those rules, which is a combination of digital service coordinators on the member state level and the Commission as an ultimate regulator on the EU level. And this is how it works. Basically, you have in every nation, in every member state, a digital services coordinator. We're still missing some of those, but in majority of the member states, they already are appointed. These are independent authorities which are tasked with implementation of the DSA within the national regulatory framework. They have the target supervision over digital services that are not designated as very large online platforms or search engines. I will be talking about that a bit later. And they need to coordinate other authorities that may have some kind of competence in the DSA, because they can be under DSA other competent authorities, but there can be only one digital services coordinator to coordinate that. And these coordinators that then are meeting usually in Brussels, the European Board for Digital Services, which gathers all of them and is an advisory body to the Commission, and is also presided by the Commission. And the Commission is the exclusive enforcer of these rules for the very large online platform search engines, which are those services that have over 45 million users in the EU monthly. Now, these are the types of entities that are being governed by the DSA. Now, the broadest category are the intermediaries, which are the services that are basically sending data from one point to another. Then you have hosting services, which are those that also host the data from users. Online platforms are those hosting services that also are distributing the data to other users. And then, as I said, very large online platforms and very large online search engines are those online platforms that have over 45 million active users in the EU monthly. Now, here you see the due diligence obligations. I won't go to the details, but on this slide, I want to show you how the tiered system works. So for all intermediaries, you have basically four basic types of due diligence obligation. It's connected to illegal content and the takedown order, so to say, that all the services need to have points of contact and legal representatives, that they need to have terms and conditions that needs to be published and available to users, and basic transparency reporting. And then when you go to hosting services, there are more obligations, online platforms, even more of that. And very large online platforms, on top of all of this, also special obligations. The most important from the perspective of my presentation today are the first two, risk assessments and mitigation measures. But then also others, of course, are not less important, I would say, but we can probably say that majority of those are trying to make the online environment much more transparent than we had before. Now, these are currently very large platforms, very large search engines. It's 25 services in total. You see it's 23 online platforms and 2 search engines. Now, for the entities to become VLOPs and VLOSs, so to say, they need to be designated by the Commission. The first round was in April 2023, when first 17 platforms and 2 search engines were designated. Since then, a few others have been designated, and this is an ongoing process. So the numbers are always counted, and if the numbers are indicating that indeed the threshold of 45 million users have been passed, then the designation will follow. This is a basic timeline for the DSA, and you see in the middle of the April 2023, the first designation. But before that, the first obligation, so to say, by the DSA kicked in for the online platforms to publish their number of active users. And for the risk mitigation and risk assessments, these are attached to 4 wider areas. The first being systemic dissemination of illegal content, then it's negative effects of fundamental rights, negative effects on civic discourse, electoral process, and public safety. And the 4th category is negative effects on minors, public health, mental and physical well-being, and gender violence. Now, the risk management cycle, so to say, would work every year. And it starts with the risk assessment, which is the obligation for the platforms to assess the risk that their platforms may pose to society and users, and then come up with risk mitigation that are addressing the risks that have been identified by the platform. Then the independent audits are stemming in. These are audits conducted by independent companies, which need to be independent from platforms, but also from governments and regulators. Then can come in, for example, guidelines that the Commission have a competence to issue on various aspects of risk mitigation. For example, it may be best practices that the platforms can come up with, and then codes of conduct, for example, and I will be talking about code of conduct on disinformation very shortly, that may somehow advise the platforms how to best assess and mitigate the risks. And ultimately, in the end of the whole cycle, is the regulatory supervision by the Commission, and then the whole cycle begins again. Now, for risk mitigation, the DSA do have examples, so it's a not exhaustive list. The mitigations can be also different things that the platforms can come up with, but the basic ones entail the adapting the design of the services themselves, adapting the terms and conditions, for example, content moderation processes, algorithmic systems, advertising systems, and so on. Now, but there are also rules how these mitigation measures can be employed and what they can be. So they need to be reasonably proportionate and effective. It means they need to actually address the problem identified, but also they can't go beyond what is necessary to mitigate that risk. So this is a kind of limit, and especially of course they need to specifically address the fundamental rights that might be breached or somehow influenced, impacted by the mitigation measure, and special it needs to be paid to the freedom of expression, of course. They need to be also based on best available information and scientific insights, and the assumptions underlying this mitigation measure need to be tested with the groups that might be most impacted by the risks and measures that are taken. Now let's turn to disinformation. This falls within the area of negative evidence and civic discourse, structural process, and public safety. And in that, you can see this is a working definition that we use, which is not a legal definition. There is no legal definition in the EU of disinformation, but this one has been used since the Democracy Action Plan and is also taken from the work under the Council of Europe. So there are three major parts of that. The information needs to be false or misleading. It needs to be used intentionally to deceive, and there needs to be a potential to cause public harm. Whatever the Commission is doing, we are always emphasizing the whole of society approach. So it's not only the Commission, other regulators, or EU institutions addressing this. It needs to be a common approach, of course. So member states, authorities are very important. Private sector, of course, predominantly online platforms there. Fact checkers, civil society, researchers. So it's a whole society kind of exercise. From our perspective, as EU institutions, there are three basic pillars. The first one is Digital Services Act.
Okay.
So yes, there are three basic pillars for the EU Commission when it comes to disinformation. The first one is the Digital Services Act, we're just talking about. Second one is the Code of Practice Disinformation that just very recently turned into Code of Conduct on disinformation. Now, that means that its Code of Conducts are enacted under the Article 45 of the DSA, and it kind of means that from the entirely sub-regulatory framework, it turned into kind of co-regulation, although this is not the word used in the DSA, but we can think about that. And what it means practically is that when I was talking about these audits done by independent auditors, the implementation of the code and the following the code commitments can now be or will be now audited by those auditors. Also, it means that the compliance officers, that is the requirement within the DSA for the services for the very large online platform search engines, they will now need to also control the compliance with the commitments of the code, and that the code can kind of be invoked to terminate or remedy potential infringement. It can, be a kind of compliance measure, but also it needs to be stressed that just by signing to the code doesn't mean that you are automatically in compliance with the DSA. But of course, if you are doing everything as the code requires and as you committed to, it's very close to what we can say that you are then safe from potential DSA infringements. But of course, again, there will be a controlling mechanism, monitoring mechanism within the code, and the compliance, so to say, needs to be verified. And then the third and important information, all of this, the code, being under the Article 45 DSA and all the implications of that will only kick in from July of this year. as was requested by the signatories, but the process of transforming the code of practice into the code of conduct has been already done. And the third pillar is European Digital Media Observatory, which is an organization based in Florence. And this is a multidisciplinary community composed of fact checkers, media literacy practitioners, researchers, and media organizations, and other stakeholders. And also it has its hubs. Now we have 14 hubs within the EU, where these members of EDMO to analyze disinformation narratives and campaigns and so on, and exchange information between each other and build up societal, or trying to build up the societal resistance to those. Now the code of conduct now have 44 commitments and 128 measures. The first iteration of the code was in 2018. In 2022, there was a new version that now stayed the same also after the transition. And now it's 44 commitments and 128 measures. And the areas that it tackles are demonetization of the disinformation, transparency of political advertising that partly overlaps with the new regulation on transparency of political advertising that will kick in October of this year. Then it's reducing manipulative behavior online, user empowerment. So to give users tools to flag, for example, narratives, disinformation, and manipulation that might be spotted, and very robust commitments around media literacy. There's a fact-checking part to the code, very prominent one, and then data access for researchers. There's also Transparency Center under the code where everybody can go and see all the commitments that the platforms subscribe to. It also needs to say that signatories of the code from 2022 onwards are not just the platforms themselves, but also researchers and other organizations that are working in the area. So now the membership, so to say, is much more broader as to the type of signatories. And there is also a governing body called Permanent Task Force, which is chaired by the Commission, and have also, of course, the signatories are there, but also ERGA, or better to say, Board of Media Services. ERGA now stopped being ERGA, and with the EMFA, now it is the Board of Media Services, but it's media organization, media regulators gathered there. EDMO, that I've talked about very recently, and external services of the European External Services, so EEAS, are also part of the task force. And part of the code is quite robust reporting. It also will inform the DSA implementation and enforcement in this area. And one relatively new thing emerging from the code is rapid response system that is envisioned by the code. It's not still absolutely done, so to say, or entirely done, but it's been already used in a pilot system. And this rapid response system is there for the crises that might emerge, but also special events or special occasions. Like usually, for now, it's used for elections. So it's been already used, for example, for elections in Romania, Croatian presidential elections, Germany election, and so on. And to my understanding, it's very close to finalization. And now let's talk about the electoral processes and risk to those, and what the Commission have been doing within the DSA for these. So far, or last year, it was quite heavy on elections, of course. It's been reported quite a lot. But our work actually started with Slovak parliamentary election, which happened in September 2023. And it was after a month of the DSA kicking in for the very large number of platform and search engines. There were first elections that we talked with platforms about how they are actually implementing the DSA in the context of elections. And this is also where the idea of so-called roundtables is stemming from, where usually the local authorities meet with the platforms, with the researchers, NGOs, and other relevant stakeholders, and the Commission, and talk about the preparations for the elections and how the various parts of the DSA may be implemented in this context. And just before the European elections, it was April 2024, the Commission issued guidelines for developers and losses on how to implement the DSA in this regard. So it took the experience that we had since Slovakia. There was also Netherlands, where there were elections, for example, and we repeat this process. So we took this experience and put it into guidelines and kind of set of expectations from the Commission for what the platforms need to do ahead of elections. And these guidelines were specifically addressing the mitigation measures. This is the Article 35 of the DSA, which gives a specific competence of the Commission to issue such guidelines. So far, these are the only guidelines that are stemming from that article. And for the whole area of information integrity, I think you can see that it's a kind of very up-to-date publication. Of course, it aims predominantly on the election integrity, but many of those recommendations are applicable also wider. So there are several parts to that, but probably we can mention that apart from the mitigation measures in general political processes, it also addresses the generative AI specifically. It was also kind of first opportunity for us to address that under the DSA. There is a part dedicated to cooperation with national authorities, independent experts, and CSOs, which kind of aims to emphasize that although these guidelines were published ahead of the European elections, they are applicable to all the elections taking place, whether it being national or even local elections, for example. And there are specific guidances on what to do during the electoral period, but also after, because usually the risk doesn't stop with the elections taking place. And this now were added to the broader DSA election toolkit, as we call it. So there's the guidelines, there is the roundtables that we are conducting with the DSCs and the member states ahead of the major elections, for example. Sometimes we are being asked to do also tabletop exercises or election readiness exercises, which are kind of in-depth exercises on the preparations ahead of elections. Usually you would come up with some artificial scenario that might happen during elections. Then you go through any available competencies and measures and actions that might be taken by different stakeholders, the communication channels that might be established. But there are also rules stemming from the DSA or measures and tools stemming from the DSA itself. So for this election-related work, it's very important that we have the DSA transparency, that we have data access tools. There's a strong collaboration with the DSCs and other authorities in member state level. Now, I've told you about the board where the DSCs meet. Within that, there are different work streams or working groups that are working on different areas within the DSA. And for information integrity, there's a working group before where usually the coordination on the election integrity is taking place. And when everything is failing or things are not going very positively, then you have regulatory tools under the DSA. So it usually starts with requests for information to the platforms about specific things that might happen or were omitted. And then there are other tools like retention orders, or if it comes to that, also Commission can open proceedings against the platforms. And currently, when it comes to election integrity, there are 3 open proceedings. One is toward X, the other is for Meta, and the last is toward TikTok. And all these experiences and all these different approaches that we use for the elections were now put together to a publication that we did with the digital service coordinators. It's called DSA Election Toolkit for Digital Service Coordinators. It's publicly available. So if you are interested in what the DSCs can do in terms of DSA implementation and DSA related tools during the election period, you can of course read the publication. And yeah, so this is for the last slide that I wanted to show you is wrapping up of all the engagement that we did during the election. So all the readiness exercises that we did, there were 3 election stress tests, and where the DSA election guidelines, and the toolkit kicked in during these processes, but DisinfoLab will send it to you so you can see that for yourself. And I will stop here with the presentation and happy to discuss. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ľuboš. I think the technical problems have been a fourth stress test organized by the Commission in relation to the DSA. There was an interesting question asked by Pavlo Karenko in Slido, which I think it raises a lot of interesting points. He asked whether enforcement of the DSA should be uniform across all EU countries or adapted to national contexts and risks. I think that gives you the opportunity to address the logic behind having a regulation in the first place.
Absolutely. And the DSA works on different levels, I would say. And one of the basic distinction that I was not specifically addressing here, but maybe this is a good place to say it, is between illegal content and non-illegal content that may be harmful, but it's not illegal, right? So for the illegal content, and it's been also, there's been a possibility before the DSA, is that national authorities, if they have the competence to address the illegal content, and there is a legislation, addressing certain kind of content as illegal, they have the competence to ask the platforms to take that down. This is national competence, and it's clarified by the DSA. There are certain criteria which needs to be met for these orders to be issued. But for the illegality of content, it usually is the local legislation that is doing that. So it means that as the rules are the same for everybody, the content itself and its illegality is addressed by the local legislation. So there you see that there can be differences, of course, how these things being applied. And for the risk management for the harmful content, so to say, that is not illegal, may cause harm to society or to users. Again, the rules around that are the same. The obligations of the platforms are the same. But as you could also probably discern from my presentation, for all the elections, there needs to be a risk assessment done differently, because all the elections will take place in a different environment, and also the risks are different. So, for example, when we met with the platforms ahead of the European elections, although it was European elections, it was EU-wide elections, we also knew, and the platforms knew that in different countries, different risks might emerge. So they need to be prepared differently. And this is why also we are meeting platforms ahead of major elections, if we are asked by the local authority, and especially the DCs, to actually discuss how they are assessing the risk for that specific situation, for those specific elections. And of course, once that this assessment is done, only then the mitigation measures can be employed. So again, also the risk mitigation measures would be different. So the basis for the DSA is the same, the structure is the same, the principles are the same, but how it would actually manifest itself in different situations would be different, because the situation in the countries and during different events is different.
Thank you, Ľuboš. An anonymous question, which requires a delicate answer. In the case of prolonged non-compliance with the code of conduct, would the Commission consider blocking a platform with cooperation of all member states?
Well, we usually refrain from this kind of extreme talk, so to say, but the code itself is a voluntary thing. So even if I was saying that the code of practice now becoming code of conduct, and from that sub-regulatory environment enters into co-regulatory, it's still a voluntary thing. So platforms do not need to sign up. If they sign up, of course, the monitoring is important, that the implementation is done right, and then it can use, or it can serve its purpose, and also kind of help them with the implementation of DSA. But if not, then it's what actually matters is the implementation of the DSA and abiding by the obligation under the DSA. So, but kind of by extension, I understand that it also can be the question: what if the DSA is not implemented right? There are many measures that can be taken. As I said, there are open proceedings against platforms, and if the outcome will be such that the DSA was breached, then the sanction will follow. Now there are different measures that can be taken even after that, but it's a very long process, and I consider is a kind of word that requires agency, and I wouldn't try to involve that in this seminar.
Thank you. There's a question that I think teases out some important detail. Could you detail the path to compliance if a given VLOP leaves the code of conduct and fails to implement equivalent measures?
Well, we have an example kind of that with X that was no signatory of the code and then left. And again, we can't anything, just respect that. On the one hand, on the other, the DSA is still here, and the obligation under DSA are still to be followed. And the opening proceeding is really going in the direction that some of the or to verify whether the measures that have been taken by the service are actually fulfilling the obligation under the DSA. So in this case, it was if there are enough to mitigate risks that are identified within the service. Now we are, the proceeding is still ongoing, so I can't say anything conclusive, but this is basically the way how to address the problem.
Thank you. Lots of delicate questions today. In your opinion, what is the role of the counter-disinformation community in this process?
Well, as I said, the approach needs to be whole society. So when it comes to the DSA enforcement, we are receiving a lot of information from all across the board, be it the national authorities or organizations or individual users. Now, when it comes to disinformation, the breach of the DSA might be only recognized if it's of systemic nature. So the DSA does not address, unless we are talking about illegal content, but when we're talking about disinformation, we are not talking about illegal content, basically. It doesn't address individual items of content. So there needs to be some kind of systemic failure on the part of the platform in order to breach the Article 34, 35 of the DSA. But of course, to gather the evidence on that, you need a lot of data. So whenever, somebody asks us, how we can send you the evidence, we are trying to make sure that, it points to some kind of systemic problem, and very probably, we would like to have some kind of context around that. But that's basically it. And then, we would like to hear about that and receive that kind of evidence. But of course, there are things that can be done, beyond that. The media literacy, for example, is a very strong part of the DSA and also of the code. So we are also supporting a lot of these initiatives that will inform users about how to address the problems themselves or how to recognize the problems themselves. So I think there's a lot that the community can do. We are also trying to support the CSOs in many manners. Usually we have meetings with them when it comes to enforcement of the DSA, so they understand what the Commission is doing and also get that feedback on them. We are consulting them whenever we are issuing major documents, for example, ahead of the election guidelines that I mentioned. We're talking to CSOs quite intensely. So I would say that the role of the community is very strong here.
A question that I think was that you have spent your entire career preparing for. The question was asked, how do we ensure coherence between the DSA and the Audiovisual Media Services Directive in the fight against disinformation?
Well, it is and you are absolutely right that I was addressing this kind of problem quite a large portion of my life. But we often need to say that the AVMSD does not address disinformation as such. There's no, it doesn't go into that kind of content. Although media regulators that are working on the AVMSD and implementing it are usually the ones that are addressing these problems in the member state when it comes to state authorities. Although it differs from country to country, but for example, when I was working in Slovakia, for example, we were doing a lot around these. But there are kind of interpretation problems between DSA and AVMSD that basically stem from different kind of language. So this is also something that now is being addressed by the Commission. And for example, there is a study now, like we open a call for that to clarify certain things between the DSA and other legislation, because it's not just the AVMSD, but AVMSD is included there. So there are talks to do that.
Thank you. There is a question on systemic failure. How is systemic failure defined, and who decides if a failure is systemic, and what criteria would you use to establish this?
Well, this is a very good question, a very tough one, and it's not being like there's no definition of that, and this is also what needs to be clarified, with in the process of applying the DSA, since we don't have any concluded procedure on the infringement on the DSA. There is nothing authoritative said. What we can say is that there needs to be failure that seems to be that the measures that the platforms employed are just not addressing. That's what we can call very broadly a systemic failure. How to prove that and what's the threshold for the evidence, that is just being worked out by our case teams in individual cases.
Thank you. If a platform continues not, there were a few questions on ongoing failures. If the platform continues to not report correctly, how does the DSA get enforced effectively?
Well, that's what the audits, for example, are for, right? To verify whether the information that the Commission and others are getting are right, and this is like from the regulatory perspective, this is a really old question. When there's a lot of transparency reports by the platform, but there was never a way how to verify the data there. And this is now changed with the DSA, and it's a clear obligation by the platforms to report accurately. So once this is a problem and it's found that the information are not precise enough and are not accurate, then it's a breach of the DSA of its own and will be treated as such.
Thank you. I vaguely remember your commissioner making a comment in this direction recently. How do you think that the compliance process itself has led to improvements in behavior by the platforms?
Well, I think a lot of things change once the DSA have been in place. Maybe just an example of that with the election integrity, when as I've been working in this environment for quite some time, I can't really say that the approach of the platforms change just from almost day to day once the DSA was applicable to them, and they needed to abide by this obligation. And we've seen that in the context of the Slovak elections, where the first elections we addressed with that. And as it was in Slovakia, which is my home country and the country I was working in before, you've seen very plastically how these things change. So, and this was for all the areas, because now what before may have been some kind of soft law arrangements and commitments by the platforms now were written in the hard law and could be enforced by an actual regulator, in this case, European Commission. So also the approach changed quite a lot, and all the engagements that we had, the measures that were put in place were quite robust from I would say from the onset. Now, of course, this may vary because during the period that DSA applied, there were some changes, and we've seen that some of the people that were working on some things are not there within the platforms, and some of these things change. So I'm not gonna say that this is working 100%, but the difference was really tangible, and yeah. So I would say that just by being entering into force, the DSA changed the landscape quite a lot.
Thank you. There's a question which I think is probably generic across all relevant regulation regarding the challenges of enforcing and collecting financial penalties for non-compliance. Do you see any particular issues with the DSA in that regard, or is it same story?
I would say it's very similar to any kind of enforcement of any kind of regulatory framework there is out there. I wouldn't say that like we are not there, so probably we are not addressing this problem. But there's a lot of literature around that, right? That even if the platforms are global, their business somehow needs to manifest locally. And if you enter into any problems in that area, this is the point that you are addressing and where you are getting those. But I don't expect this kind of problem coming anytime soon.
Straightforward question, but I think it gives an opportunity to address an important point. How do we ensure the continued trustworthiness of trusted flaggers?
Well, the trusted flaggers are a kind of it's just being rolled out, the whole system. Of course, they need to be appointed by the digital services coordinators, and I don't know if this is where the question is aiming at, but the digital service coordinator need to be independent, of course, need to be functioning properly in order to designate as trusted flaggers entities and organizations that are fit to do this kind of work. So it's I wouldn't try to address now like hypothetical problems that might stem from it, but there's a community of DSCs. There's a board where the DSCs meet, and there are basic rules under which the trusted flaggers are to be appointed. And if there are problems there, I would say that the Commission, in cooperation with other DSCs, would address those.
Do you think, if I can add my own sub-question to that, do you think that the extensive reporting obligations on the trusted flaggers make the task of making sure that they're trustworthy on an ongoing basis easier and more reliable?
Well, hopefully, like we don't have no experience with that, so but yeah, that's the idea.
Thank you. So I'm just going through the questions again. Another interesting question from Pavlo. To what extent is the DSA prepared to deal with state-sponsored disinformation campaigns from within EU member states? I'm not sure if that's from the member states or it's from within. I think it's the latter.
Yeah, but my answer would be probably the same for both, because from perspective of the DSA, a risk is a risk whether it comes from outside of the EU, within the EU, within the national context, and of course for this disinformation too, like it's from this perspective, it's neutral. Like this, if there's a risk, it needs to be identified by the risk assessments and needs to be addressed by the risk mitigation. So whether it is state sponsored or and anything else, it still needs to be addressed in, I would say, the same way. So there's no real distinction there. You probably heard about the FIMI concept, for example, that is being used in this context quite a lot. For our purposes, of course, we acknowledge that and work also with the notion. But again, FIMI being foreign kind of interference, it's from the DSA perspective, we are really like neutral to where the risk is coming from. If there's a risk needs to be identified, it needs to be mitigated.
A probably useful question for teasing out some of the detail. How does a platform decide the type and amount of content that needs to be moderated? And more straightforwardly, how can we get data on the moderated content from the platforms?
Well, the platforms is free to have their own, their own rules on what to do, within, so for, like the rules for their users, and also when it comes to content. There are of course limits to that given by the DSA. It's we can't tell the platforms how to address things. There may be recommendations, for example. There may be some best practices that the platforms can exchange between themselves, and we can be part of those debates. But it's really up to the platforms to do that. And also when it comes to the type of mitigation measures against that. Again, what is important is that the problems are identified and then are addressed. And both of these things need to be effective, proportionate, as I was explaining during my presentation. How we can get data on moderated content, there is a database of that. So we have database, which is again a great boost to transparency for the online environment, where the platforms need to publish all the actions they've taken against content on their platforms. We are hearing, there are some drawbacks still within that, so we're working on it. But they're within the transparency, all the content moderation decisions are available. So there you will get, if not all, a lot of data on those.
Thank you. To answer the people asking questions about whether we are on Blue Sky, we are, and we'll include details of where to find your slides in due course. So I think that was most of the questions that were asked by the audience. There were some questions on implying the DSA as a geopolitical football that I'm not sure is within your remit, Ľuboš. So
it's not.
So I'm sorry to the askers of those questions. I will bring your Q&A session to a close and in that case. And thank you very much, Ľuboš, for your time, and apologies to participants for the technical problems. The next webinars are on the 17th of April and the 30th of April. The 17th of April is Disinformation and Real Estate Exploitation, the case of Russia. And on the 30th, we have Exploring Political Advertising Data, Who Targets Me?, which promises to be a very interesting session indeed. So on that interesting note for the future webinars, I would like to thank Ľuboš again. Thank you to the participants, to the people that asked a lot of very interesting questions, and I look forward to seeing you all next time.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to everybody. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.